Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today in this module we are going to talk about commons and understanding common pool resources. In this module we look at the concept of commons within the discipline of economics and natural resources. It talks about how common property resources are very important for livelihoods in South Asia. This module talks about the institutions around commons and common property resources in India and subcontinent, and it reviews some major debates in academia on governing the commons. The module is divided into 5 main themes. We start with defining commons, then we talk about importance of commons in South Asian region. We then move to discuss about institutions around commons, something that some academicians have termed as dying wisdom. We then look at nationwide assessment of CPRs, common property resources, and then we move to some academic debates around common property resources. And lastly, we discuss new and emergent commons, both urban commons as well as global commons. So let's start with defining commons or common property resources. What do we mean when we use the term commons or common property resources? Common property resources have been defined in a number of different ways in available literature. According to the most popular understanding of this concept, I quote, CPRs are owned by an identified set of people who have the right to exclude non-owners and duty to maintain the property through constraints put on its use, unquote. Common property resources are thus owned, held in trust and managed by an identified set of people who have control over its access, use or extraction, as against the private or government ownership. In short, the term commons denotes forms of collective ownership over a resource as opposed to private property where the ownership lies exclusively with an individual or a family or a corporate entity. Thus, some of the examples of commons are pastures, sacred groves, village ponds, and so on. The conceptual approaches on commons vary over a wide range. At one extreme, there is an approach that treats all that is not private property as common property. The approach at the other extreme adopts a much more stringent view to distinguish between common property and free rider or free or open access resources. The latter category is characterized by the absence of any rules for management of resources. The proponents of this approach hold that the resource becomes common property only when the group of people who have the right to its collective use is well defined, and the rules that govern their use of it are set out clearly and followed universally. In their view, common property implies the existence of an institutional arrangement for management of the resources. Studies on commons also include the information commons, with issues about public knowledge, public domain, open science, open data, open budgeting, and free exchange of ideas, all issues at the core of direct participatory democracy. There is a growing volume of scholarly work on new or non-traditional commons such as urban commons, the internet, electromagnetic spectrum, genetic data, budgets, etc. The urge of creating global commons to enable intercultural contact and communication has also got reflected through the desire and several efforts, many unsuccessful and a few successful, to create a universal language that every human being potential can have a stake into and a right over. Some have argued that the idea of commons comes from the English tradition emerging from the Magna Carta, and the concept gets universalized with the shaping of ecological commons. In his brilliant essay, The Secret History of Magna Carta, Peter Lanebaugh explains in details how the Magna Carta has inspired generations to draw upon, while stating that Magna Carta is not a manifesto of the medieval commons, yet it refers to substantive customs of the wooded realm that supported a material culture. Eleanor Ostrom, the renowned scholar who studied commons, outlines 8 design principles which are prerequisites for stable CPR arrangements. In her 2009 Nobel Prize winning book, Governing the Commons, The Evolution of Institutions for Collective Actions. These 8 design principles are: first, clearly defined boundaries; second, congruence between appropriation and provision rules and local conditions; third, collective choice arrangements allowing for the participation of most of the appropriators in the decision making process. Fourth, effective monitoring by monitors who are part of or accountable to the appropriators. Fifth, graduated sanctions for appropriators who do not respect community rules. 6. Conflict resolution mechanism which are cheap and easy of access. 7th, minimum recognition of rights to organize. And 8th, the case of larger CPRs, organizations in the form of multiple layers of nested enterprises with small local CPRs at the basis. Let's talk about importance of commons in South Asian region. In South Asia and in Indian subcontinent, there has been several community institutions marking the relationship between the community and natural resource base. In South Asia, property rights over many different resources are either de facto or de jure held by communities. In this part of the world, the share of common property is fairly voluminous in terms of resource inputs for sustaining local livelihoods, and rights over such land, water and forest resources are shared by multiple beneficiaries. As per different estimates by scholars, the extent of livelihood dependence over CPRs ranges from 15 to 29% in South Asia, whereas in parts of Africa where pastoral societies abound, the livelihood dependence on CPR has been found to be in the range of 35 to 51%. Studies on CPRs came into the forefront with a seminal article by N.S. Jodha in mid-1980s in the journal Economic and Political Weekly, titled Common Property Resources and the Rural Poor, which presents the scenario existing in semi-arid regions in India. 2 decades after that moment, Jodha records there has been 40 to 50% decline in CPR area in his study region, and 25 to 85% of CPRs from his study area were reported to have attained degraded status. Part of the explanation probably lies in the decline of traditional management institutions and rules reported from 88 to 97% of villages studied. So let's talk about institutions around commons. Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan traced the typology of myriad rainwater harvesting systems around the country and the status in their 1997 book, Dying Wisdom, Rise and Fall of India's Water Harvesting Systems. Most of these systems were rooted in village communities and had highly evolved governance and management processes. While it is true that large number of people are supported by common property for the livelihoods in developing countries through stable forms of resource management, in last 2 centuries of developmentalist state has pursued an agenda that turns poor people's resource proximate status into a curse. Over the years, many different factors such as population growth, technological change, climate change and political realignments have led to destabilization of many existing common property institutions. This has led to situations where both community ownership of resources coexists with evolving and often incomplete private property rights. Similar to myriad rainwater harvesting systems, India represents diversity of grasslands or village grazing grounds and nomadic livestock keepers. Sumit Guha looks at the period 1600 to 2000 and states that while 400 years ago, 25% of India's landmass was cultivable arable, and within this short span, the expansion of cultivation has meant that cultivable arable now occupies almost half of India's landmass. The logical corollary of this was that grazing land and land that was demarcated as permanent pressures came under increasing attrition. L.B. Kulkarni, in his 1928 monograph, Improvement of Grazing Areas in Bombay Presidency, had written about the diminishing grazing land, and I quote, until the last half century, there were in this presidency extensive wastelands, such as common grazing grounds, which in good years at any rate provided for the village herds a fair quantity of fodder. But owing to the demand for cultivation of food and commercial crops, which tend to increase at the same time the required number of cattle, and to reduce the grazing as well as the production of fodder on the cultivable lands, the area available for common grazing by paying a small fee to the private owner has been reduced in almost every part of Bombay Presidency. The very salutary old Mohammedan rule, which provided that there should be 1 acre of grazing land to every 10 acres of cultivable land, has largely been forgotten, and the areas still available have been and are still being seriously overgrazed with evil results not only for cattle but also to the grazing lands themselves. Unquote. Let's talk about nationwide assessment of CPRs. In recent times, scholars who studied commons have tried to estimate both the magnitude of commons as well as its diminishing status by employing various methodologies such as village surveys, reclassification of land use categories, ethnography of common dependent communities, etc. Even though satellite imagery helps in keeping a tab on changing land use and the status of natural resources, its use has been rather limited. Professor Kanchan Chopra states that in 1980s, when economists started to pay attention to CPRs, estimates fell within reasonable range, with states which had witnessed advanced agricultural system reporting 5 to 7% of land under CPRs, and those other states supporting rain-fed agriculture and pastoralism reporting 25 to 32% of land under CPRs. Within 2 decades, lands under CPRs have faced so much attrition that it diminished from 25% to 21.25%. The only large-scale countrywide survey of the size, utilization and contribution of CPRs in the lives and economy of rural India has been the 54th round of National Sample Survey Organization in the year 1998. Based on a sample survey carried out across 5,242 villages, covering 78,990 households from 12 agroclimatic zones, this survey by NSS concluded that CPRs account for 15% of geographical area and amount to 0.31 hectares per household. This survey also revealed that as many as 58% of fuel wood requirement and up to 25% of fodder requirement are derived from CPRs. This survey also raised the concern over the rapid depletion of CPRs by estimating the decrease of CPR lands in rural India at 2% every 5 years. Unfortunately, NSSO has not revisited the issue of CPRs with another large-scale nationwide survey, which would have made it possible for scholars working on CPRs to understand the changes. Let's talk about some academic debates around CPRs. Daniel W. Bromley refers to the concept commons or common property resources in the literature on natural resources and environmental policy making as a concept that is often misunderstood and misrepresented. He argues that, I quote, "The fallacy in traditional approaches to commons is that writers have failed to understand the concept of property. They have very often treated a particular natural resource as if it had inherent characteristics that suggested it would everywhere be controlled under a particular type of property regime. They have invariably failed to learn that the world is replete with reasonably successful common property regime." Unquote. Bromley advises us to understand that there is no such thing as common property resource. There are only resources controlled and managed as common property, or as state property, or as private property. He also asks us to acknowledge that there are also resources over which no property rights have been recognized, and hence those are suitable instances of the expression open access resources, or res nullius, which is Latin for no one's property. Eleanor Ostrom states in contrast to open access resources in the instance of those resources on which property rights exist, whether private property, state property or common property, overexploitation and destruction depends on how well the property rights regime copes with the problem of allocating the costs and benefits of managing and governing a particular resource. Unquote. While there existed modes of resource use that assign greater ethical import to the culture of sharing, as Ostrom has shown, even before Garrett Hardin's oft-quoted 1968 article in the journal Science, there were views and opinions that referred to the metaphor tragedy of commons. However, when Hardin used the metaphor of grazing commons to refer to the general problem of population, he was doing so in a world where livestock science had created terms such as overgrazing and overstocking. Hardin asks his reader to imagine a pasture open to all and invites him to examine the structure of the situation from the perspective of a rational herder. Supposing each herder would receive a direct benefits by adding one more animal on pasture and increasing his herd and bears deferred costs from gradual deterioration of grazing due to overgrazing. Hardin thus concludes, I quote, "There is in this a tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit, in a world that is limited. Ruin is the destination towards which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons, unquote. It has been argued that this parable ignores considerable historical experience and evidence to the contrary and flows from the failure to distinguish the problem of free and open access from those of common property resources. Those errors are now being increasingly acknowledged by economists, and Dasgupta has stated without mincing words that, I quote, "It would be difficult to locate another passage of comparable length and fame containing as many errors," unquote. Writing a foreword to collection of essays on commons, Robert B. Hawkins refers to a common historical myth that has a tendency to perpetuate, suggesting that, I quote, Europe's peasants and yeomen who worked the commons were efficient cultivators, and that it took the post-enclosure movements of the 15th and 16th century, turning the commons into a private property to bring efficiency and increased productivity to agriculture, unquote. He also indicts contemporary social scientists who, like yesterday's nobility, often take a jaundiced view of common property institutions, again making the commons an object of derision and reform. He also points at another category of theorists who, while decrying the tragedy of commons, rely on arid reasoning of the prisoner's dilemma to demonstrate the impossibility of long-lasting voluntary cooperation of effective collective action. In short, the working assumption amongst economists and political scientists after Hardin's essay and Menker-Olson's The Logic of Collective Action, which got published in 1965, was that self-interested individuals will hesitate to act in a collective manner to provide common goods or to conserve and protect shared resources. Yet, as Eleanor Ostrom has shown through her writings, throughout this period and subsequent decades, there was no dearth of evidence that in poor countries where there were many instances of people coming together for protection, conservation, and shared use of local commons. Ostrom and her contemporary researchers showed, theoretically and empirically, that norms of cooperation and trust building could emerge and be sustained. Thus, research on the commons in the last 2 decades has highlighted the dialogic space that could emerge between economists and anthropologists when they bring their respective disciplinary strength to inform the governance issues in development policy. 2 volumes that merit attention in this context are R. Khate, N.S. Chodha and Mukhopadhyay P. edited volume in 2008 called Promise, Trust and Evolution, Managing the Commons of South Asia, that got published by Oxford University Press, and another volume that got published by Blackwell Publishing in the year 2008, edited by Pranab Bardhan and Isha Ray, called The Contested Commons, Conversations Between Economists and Anthropologists. At the Annapolis Conference, the Conference on Common Property Resource Management, participants strongly articulated a view of the type of policies that donors and governments of developing countries should adopt on the governance and management of commons. The participant had recommended that current presumptions that local rules and customs were lacking for most common pool resources be abandoned. Instead, donors and governments of developing countries were asked to bear the burden of proof to demonstrate the absence of local customs and rules before intervening to impose new ones. Thus, concluding in nutshell the message of Annapolis Conference, Eleanor Ostrom states that the advice was, first, if people have lived in close relationship with common pool resource system over a long period of time, they have probably evolved some system to limit and regulate use patterns. Second, before one imposes new rules on local systems, inquiries should be made to determine if some rules and customs do not already exist. Third, if some customs and rules do exist, study them carefully in order to understand how they affect use patterns over time. Fourth, propose new rules only after you have convinced yourself that either no rules or custom exist, or the rules and custom that do exist are not effective in achieving regulation or produce substantial inefficiency, inequity, or both. And you are thoroughly familiar with the configuration of institutions in existence that may affect how new rule will operate in practice. Fifth, maintaining and enforcing new rules depends upon people finding those rules to be acceptable and an acceptable way of ordering the relationship with one another as a community. And sixth, new rules cannot very dramatically be different from the existing repertoire of rules in use, or they will exist only on paper and not in the minds of those who must understand the rules to make them work. Let's now talk about new and emergent commons. at both urban and global level. Professor Kanchan Chopra also alludes to newer forms of commons that are emerging at two different sites and scale. Chopra states in her article in 2011, and I quote, "Growing urbanization means that newer kinds of urban communities are coming up. These are often referred to as gated communities with access to their assets and common spaces being restricted to residents who are also responsible for their maintenance. The emergence of these urban CPRs has come about as a consequence of the felt need for some common services by way of security, green areas, and waste management. In some cases, we have fairly successful management. Beyond the minimum level of common interests, these communities also run into problems of diversity of interests, etc., of stakeholders. In the context of increasing urbanization and migration, it is important to see what makes these communities work. It also brings home the point that the commoners and issues related to them will continue to emerge as long as humans live in close proximity and share resources and the environment." Unquote. Similarly, in the context of climate change and global warming, Kanchan Chopra puts forward a suggestion of looking at atmosphere as an indivisible global common shared by all inhabitants of the planet. Chopra states, I quote, "At the start of 21st century, the nations of the world are seeking solutions to the damage inflicted on the global commons by greenhouse gas emissions. In this case, we have inequity across nations, we have prior history, and we have very few global institutions whose writ is accepted by all. In other words, as nations of the world, contributing and constituting the so-called global village, we shall interact on issues of limiting greenhouse gas emissions that endanger the global commons. We find many similarities with the village communities here. Will the global village be able to exhibit some and similar foresights and wisdom in solving its problems? The challenge will require the construction of a new international institutional structure focusing on efficient design rules of efficiency and drawing on shared values and trust for long-term sustainability. Whatever be the outcome, the conceptualization of the commons as shared spaces between societies, nation states, and international corporations will continue to be significant. Simultaneously, navigating international global changes and preparing for future uncertainty will continue to present the challenge of setting up a co-evolving set of globally focused collaborative institutions. And what we learn from the village commons and the national commons will continue to be relevant. Thank you.